NBA and Los Angeles Clippers, who are now 5-16 and a complete disaster. They announced this morning that Chris Paul is no longer a part of their team.
The NBA woke up to absolute chaos. The Los Angeles Clippers, sitting at a miserable 5-16, drowning in disaster, dropped a nuclear announcement. Chris Paul was no longer part of the franchise. The shockwaves hit instantly. Nobody could process how one of the greatest point guards to ever touch the floor had just been thrown aside like that. But then came the twist nobody saw coming. James Harden and Kawhi Leonard stepped forward with revelation about Ty Lue's involvement that turned this entire situation from messy to terrifying. Let's dive into the midnight meltdown that shattered the NBA. 3 a.m., the moment everything broke. Picture the scene. East Coast. December 4th, 2025. It's nearly pitch black outside. The Clippers are holed up in an Atlanta hotel tonight before their matchup with the Hawks. Normal people? They're asleep. But Chris Paul, 12-time All-Star, 11-time All-NBA, the maestro of the Lob City era, a man whose playmaking sits just beneath John Stockton in the history books, is wide awake. Because minutes earlier, he was told something that shattered his entire world. His second run with the Clippers, the franchise where he built his legend, was over. And here's where the story stops making sense and turns into something out of a Netflix scandal series. CP3 didn't hear this news from ownership. He didn't get a respectful office sit-down. Not even a private call from the front office. No, Chris Paul was told he was being cut during a 3-hour, tense, late-night confrontation inside the team hotel with President Lawrence Frank. Miles away from home, in the middle of a road trip. And the minute that emotional meeting ended, Paul exploded onto Instagram with a message that froze the internet. Just found out I'm being sent home. Peace. One line. A peace sign emoji. That's all it took for the NBA universe to lose its mind. One of the greatest floor generals ever. Dismissed with a single emoji. But it gets worse. Much worse. Because while fans were still processing this insanity, the real earthquake hit. James Harden, Kawhi Leonard, the two pillars of this franchise, found out the same way the rest of the U.S. did. Through their phones. No heads up. No team meeting. No courtesy text. Nothing. They woke up, checked social media, and boom! Chris Paul was gone. If you want to understand how dysfunctional this organization has become, that detail says everything. Player reactions. Pure shock. After their 159-92 win against Atlanta later that night, reporters swarmed both stars hunting for answers. James Harden, who shared a complicated history with CP3 in Houston, didn't even pretend to hide his confusion. I'm just as confused and shocked as you guys. Not just Chris. There's a lot we were dealing with. That line right there, that was the moment the entire NBA realized this wasn't about one player. This was a symptom of something deeply broken inside the Clippers' walls. Harden practically admitted there are issues stacked behind the scenes. Issues the front office thinks can be solved by pushing Chris Paul out the door in the dead of night. And then there's Kawhi, the quietest superstar in basketball. A man who rarely reveals anything. Yet even he couldn't hide his disbelief. Shocking to me. What made it even wilder is what he said next. He had just been discussing improvements with Chris Paul days earlier. They were actively working together to fix the team. And then, out of nowhere, CP3 was treated like a problem that needed to be shipped away instantly. Who's really to blame? Some fans tried turning their attention to the players. But the analysts on PTI didn't mince words. This is on the GM and the coach. They're a disaster. They've lost 14 of their last 16 games. The Clippers aren't just losing games. They're losing control. And this Chris Paul saga? It's only the beginning. Now, let's unravel the chain reaction that created this full-blown catastrophe. Because the way this entire meltdown unfolded almost feels scripted. The warning signs have been building for weeks. Chris Paul, the veteran floor general known for demanding excellence, had been increasingly vocal behind the scenes. He was calling out everyone, players, coaches, even the front office, pushing for accountability that the franchise clearly wasn't ready for. And that intensity? It didn't sit well with head coach Ty Lue. What started as quiet frustration reportedly grew into a silent Cold War. Multiple insiders claim that CP3 and Lue weren't even speaking. Not in practice, not in meetings, not anywhere, outside of the bare minimum on-court dialogue required to run a game. Meanwhile, the Clippers were sinking deeper into humiliation. A pathetic 6-16 start. Second worst in the West. Zero control of their own future because their draft pick already belonged to Oklahoma City. The team was spiraling, losing games they couldn't afford to lose, unable to rebuild, and drowning in a toxic mix of panic, tension, and ego. We've already covered Harden and Kawhi's shock. Now it's time to go inside the war room, because the rift between Chris Paul and Ty Lue wasn't just a disagreement. It was the fuse that eventually blew the franchise apart. Inside the rift, Chris Paul versus Ty Lue. What actually happened? Reports from inside the organization paint a messy picture. Paul and Lue had allegedly gone from uneasy allies to estranged co-workers. Their conversations had become strictly transactional. No strategic discussions. No trust. No relationship. Ty Lue denied all of this publicly, and he denied it hard. That's not true, he insisted whenever asked. But the evidence that surfaced afterward told a different story entirely. When Lue finally spoke to media, his tone said everything. He tried to keep it diplomatic, but his words were like cracks in a dam. It wasn't a good fit. I don't like how it ended, but the organization made the call. Translation? Whatever the Clippers hoped Paul would bring, it didn't happen. His demanding, control-driven leadership clashed heavily with the team's direction. And then came the incident. The one insiders say was a breaking point. The Jeff Van Gundy confrontation. The moment the relationship exploded. During a matchup against the Mavericks, Kawhi Leonard was on a strict minute limit. After checking back in late in the fourth quarter, he struggled to keep pace with Klay Thompson, who was heating up. Seeing this, Chris Paul did what Chris Paul always does. He tried to coach the moment. He asked Kawhi if he still felt fresh enough to guard Klay. He floated the idea of switching defensive assignments until Kawhi got his rhythm back. He talked to teammates about adjusting. It was leadership. It was instinct. And according to Chris Haynes, it was the spark that lit the fuse. Because the next day on the team plane, Jeff Van Gundy called Paul over for a conversation. But it wasn't a conversation. It was a confrontation. Paul explained that he didn't override anything. He simply suggested an adjustment. Van Gundy snapped back with a message that couldn't have been more clear. You might have had that freedom in other places, but you don't have that here. That line, cold, sharp, territorial, exposed everything. The coaches didn't want Chris Paul leading. They didn't want him adjusting. They didn't want him calling anything. They wanted control. And they were letting him know, publicly and privately, that his influence didn't matter here. Multiple insiders reported that this wasn't the only heated exchange between Van Gundy and CP3. It was just the one that finally spilled into daylight. Paul's response was subtle but vicious. He went on Instagram and posted the definition of the word leeway. One screenshot, one word, one message. You don't respect me and I'm done pretending you do. Analysts on NBA on Prime didn't mince words either. Udonis Haslem, who understands locker room politics better than almost anyone alive, broke it down. Conversations like the one Paul tried to have, those are supposed to be normal. They're supposed to be built on trust. They're supposed to strengthen teams, not blow them up. And the fact that it turned into a conflict told you everything. The Clippers' foundation was already cracking. This was just the first visible break. Udonis Haslem broke it down perfectly. Those mid-huddle whispers, the hey, look for this, watch for that conversations. Those only happen when there's trust. Trust between players. Trust between players and coaches. Trust built over years. And when that trust collapses, one voice can fracture an entire locker room. But the accusations coming out of the Clippers camp don't end with one misunderstanding. According to insiders who've spoken to former players and people close to the organization, CP3's relentless critiques of practices, rotations, effort, discipline had started to wear down the very people he was supposed to lead. Even Harden and Kawhi, who publicly acted blindsided, were reportedly exhausted behind closed doors. Not angry, not rebellious, just tired. Kendrick Perkins, a guy who's been in the fire of toxic locker rooms, broke it down raw. He suggested that for Ty Lue to stop speaking to someone entirely, something major had to happen. Something deeper than one confrontation. When you hear that Ty Lue wasn't speaking to CP for weeks, Perkins said, you start asking what was CP3 really doing? Because you don't send a dude home at 3 a.m. without build-up. Behind-the-scenes sources claim Paul had started maneuvering behind Lue's back, talking players privately, voicing frustrations, stirring tension in a team that was already drowning in it. And whether that's true or not, one thing is undeniable. This wasn't one incident. This was pressure building brick by brick until the wall finally collapsed. To be clear, we're hearing multiple sides of the story. No one outside that locker room knows the full truth. The reality is probably somewhere in the messy middle. But one thing Ty Lue made absolutely clear, he didn't want CP3's story to end this way. When asked point blank if he wanted Paul to go out like this, Lue's response carried a weight that told its own story. No, I've got a lot of respect for him. He's been a friend of mine for years. You never want to see a great go out like this, but I'm sure he'll land somewhere. He's still a great player. And then came the question that changed everything. Did Ty Lue agree with the decision to send Paul home? Was he even part of it? His answer was complicated, almost too honest. He admitted cutting Chris Paul wouldn't magically fix anything. I don't think the reason we're 5-16 is because of CP's play. So even the head coach, the man supposedly feuding with Chris Paul, said removing him wouldn't solve the team's problems. Which begs the question, then who made this call? And why? Because right now, the Clippers are not just losing, they're collapsing. 28th in scoring, bleeding points defensively, star player injured, team chemistry deteriorating like wet paper. This wasn't a basketball decision. This was something deeper, darker, more chaotic. And now the real questions begin. Where does Chris Paul go from here? What does this mean for the Clippers season, already sinking fast? And what does this seismic decision mean for the rest of the NBA? Because this wasn't just a roster move. This was a warning shot. And the fallout is only beginning. The shockwaves have only begun, and the fallout from his decision is already reshaping careers, reputations, and futures across the NBA. But let's start with the man at the center of the storm, Chris Paul. Because even after everything that's happened, after one of the most unceremonious exits in recent memory, CP3 has handled this chaos with a level of grace most players could never muster. In a quiet, heartfelt conversation with People magazine on December 9th, Paul didn't lash out. He didn't take shots. He didn't burn bridges. He simply said, I'm at peace with everything. And he meant it instead of bitterness. He spoke about gratitude, about finally getting a chance to show up for his son's upcoming game, about being grounded, present, and ready for whatever comes next. When insider Chris Haynes reached out to ask about Paul's future, the answer was vintage CP3. I'm staying ready. I'm hooping right now. I don't know what's next. No excuses. No negativity. Just a 21-year veteran who's been through every battle the league can offer and still refuses to fold. This is a man who's been traded, doubted, criticized, celebrated, and everything in between, and has never stopped being the consummate professional. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. Because this season wasn't supposed to be a chapter filled with drama. This was supposed to be the ending, the final act, the victory lap. When Chris Paul signed with the Clippers back in July 2025, he framed it as his last dance, a poetic return to the city where his superstardom began. His emotions were raw the day he signed, speechless, grateful, hopeful. It's something I've manifested for years, he admitted. A dream finish, a homecoming, a chance to walk away on his own terms. And instead, it's crumbled into one of the most abrupt and humiliating departures the league has seen in decades. Where does Chris Paul go next? On December 15th, he becomes trade eligible, opening the door for a new chapter. Maybe even redemption. Rumors are swirling everywhere. A Hollywood ending with the Lakers and LeBron. A return to Oklahoma City to mentor Shai Gilgeous-Alexander one last time. Cleveland listed as betting favorites. Miami and San Antonio lurking as dark horses. But the destination isn't the real story here. The outrage is because the way CP3 was treated has ignited a firestorm. Stephen A. Smith didn't just criticize the Clippers. He torched them. This is Chris Paul, CP3, and you send him home in the middle of the night? It's pathetic. He read off the resume. 12-time All-Star, 11-time All-NBA, 75th anniversary team, former NBPA president, and asked the question everyone is thinking. How do you disrespect a legend like this? Draymond Green warned players across the league. If this can happen to Chris Paul, it can happen to anyone. Carmelo Anthony called it flat-out disrespectful. Analysts everywhere blasted the franchise. And suddenly Los Angeles, the Clippers side of Los Angeles, is looking like a place no star wants to go near. The organizational meltdown no one is talking about. The truth is this: the Chris Paul situation is just smoke coming from a much bigger fire. This franchise has been spiraling under the weight of years of reckless decisions. They gave up Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Danilo Gallinari, and 7-pick/swaps for Paul George, who left for nothing. They emptied more assets for James Harden. They repeatedly maxed out Kawhi despite constant injuries. And now they're sitting at 6-18, the oldest team in the NBA, barely holding their season together by duct tape. Stephen A. even questioned how Lawrence Frank rose to power in the first place, calling the situation suspicious at best. Then came the point that cut the deepest: locker room decisions being made by people who aren't even in the locker room. Udonis Haslem put it bluntly: if you're not in the sanctuary every day, you don't get to dictate what happens inside of it. In other words, this wasn't basketball operations. This was disconnect, power, ego, and a franchise that has completely lost its identity. So what's the truth? Look, Chris Paul is intense. He demands excellence. His leadership can be hard. That style has transformed young teams, but it can rub veterans the wrong way. At the same time, nothing, and I mean nothing, justifies how he was treated. You don't send a first ballot Hall of Famer home at 3 a.m. during a road trip. You don't deliver life-changing news in a hotel room 3 states away from his family. You bring him home. You sit him down. You talk face-to-face. You show him the respect he earned over 2 decades. Stephen A. put it perfectly. After 21 years, you don't do that to Chris Paul. But that's exactly what happened. And now the Clippers will live with the consequences. Their reputation? Damaged. Their locker room? Cracked. Their future? Uncertain. Their star players? Forced to navigate chaos they didn't ask for. Yes, Harden and Kawhi looked shocked publicly. But deep down, you have to wonder how much they really knew, and how much they were willing to ignore. The Chris Paul chapter of the Clippers saga is officially closed. But the ripple effects are just beginning. What happens to CP3? What happens to the Clippers? And what does this mean for every star watching from afar? This story won't disappear anytime soon. In fact, it might just be the beginning of something even bigger. Thank you for watching. Click one of the videos on screen to dive into more stories just like this, because the NBA world isn't done shaking yet.